Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. Kara Goldin knows what it takes to build a business and a brand from scratch. She's the founder of Hint Inc., best known for its award-winning Hint water, the leading unsweetened flavored water. Hint was inspired by Kara's own health journey when she kicked her diet soda habit by turning to fruit-infused water. After discovering there was nothing like the fruit-flavored water on the market, she decided to make it herself. Kara is a former tech executive at AOL, host of the podcast The Kara Goldin Show, and author of Undaunted. She's been named one of Fast Company's most creative people in business and to Forbes' most powerful woman entrepreneurs list. In our conversation today, we talk about how to move forward despite uncertainty, turn criticism into motivation, and create your own opportunities. Get ready to live undaunted. Here's my conversation with Kara Goldin. Kara, what a treat to have you on. Thank you so much for taking a minute. You're a busy lady.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kara, your career journey, started and I loved reading about it in Undaunted. Your book it's fantastic. But your journey isn't what a lot of people would expect, right? And I think it's funny because you kind of call yourself an accidental entrepreneur. And I find that interesting. Can you kind of give me a quick snapshot, right, of your resume before you started Hint?
Yeah, so I was a girl who grew up in Arizona, having a dream to actually be a journalist. I moved to New York City, where I started my career at Time Magazine, and not in the editorial side where I wanted to be, but in something called circulation. I remember my first day on the job, I didn't even know what circulation was. I just was enamored with the idea that I was working inside the Time and Life building. And living in New York City, it was all great. Anyway, I learned what circulation was. I mention it only because that sort of led me kind of to my next role a couple later. But right after Time, I was recruited out to be in a late stage startup. We didn't call it a late stage startup back then, but a company called CNN, which you're in Atlanta. It's Ted Turner was still running around our office in New York and had this dream of worldwide news. And some days we said, okay, Ted, we believe you. Other days we're like,
he was wide open, wasn't he?
Right. I don't know if it's really going to work out or not. It was like 40% of the country had CNN, 40% of the U.S., less than 10 outside of the U.S. And I was there during a really crazy, interesting time when the Gulf War rolled around, which put CNN on the map. And then I met my husband in New York, my soon-to-be husband. And he was graduating from law school, and we moved out to San Francisco. He wanted to get into this thing called technology law. All the New York law firms said, go west. This is 1994. And he went into a law firm, and I didn't know anybody, but I had been following this guy, Steve Jobs, and he was with a brand called Apple. And I had an iMac when I was in college, and I thought I could tell you exactly why I liked it. It was design. It was simple. I didn't know how it worked or why it was different from other computers, but aesthetically, I liked it. And so I couldn't figure out how to get a job at Apple. I truly figured out that Cupertino, where Apple headquarters was about 100 miles from San Francisco. So I thought that'll be a real pain to commute. And so I didn't know if I was actually really that serious about taking a job there. But in my research, I found this little startup that was a Steve Jobs idea that was only about 40 miles away from San Francisco. And they were doing this thing called CD-ROM shopping. And I thought it was fascinating that there was this idea where they would take graphics and they would put them on a disc. So I thought, I'm going to call this guy. It was in the Wall Street Journal. I found his name and called him up and I said, hey, I just moved to the Bay Area and I worked at CNN and a little company in New York. And he said, oh my God, what's Ted Turner like? And here I'm thinking, you guys all worked for Steve. He wants to know what it was like to work for Ted. Just the idea that I was working for another founder and the idea that on the other coast, there was this brand that in his mind was really interesting. Well, I convinced him to have coffee with me. And soon I received a job offer. I opened my big mouth because I kept thinking about how do we build a business? This was a group of product and engineers who were just focused on building a product, not really focused on monetizing it. So I got this job offer, five guys and me, and everybody's in jeans and t-shirts. And I thought, that's not what happened in New York. I mean, Ted wore suits and cowboy boots, but so I take this role, and one of our investors, about a year later, was building out a marketplace, a company called America Online, and they were kind of the underdog in the online services industry. There was Prodigy and CompuServe, and there was AOL. So they invested in us and they acquired us shortly after because they figured that'd be cheaper to do that. And so part of the acquisition, they asked me to run this thing called shopping partnerships. And so my role was very similar to what I did at Two Market, go out to retailers and get them to partner with us, build a store online. And so soon we did away with the disc, and my role was just to build out this like online mall on America Online. And so I was traveling all over the US. 7 years later, it was $1 billion in revenue to AOL. And that's when I thought, I have a young family in San Francisco. My husband is in-house at a company called Netscape now. And I think I want to stay home. I don't want to be getting on United flights and having the pilots all know my name. And I have like two kids. I had a third one on the way, and I thought I want to be here. I never really thought at that point that I would do anything but tech. I never thought that I was going to go be an entrepreneur. But for me, it was really about figuring out a problem that I had an idea to solve. And I had gained a bunch of weight through the course of my pregnancies, never really thought about, I wasn't sharing that with too many people. I just sort of had accepted it, I guess. And it was not until I started really focusing on my kids while I was taking this 2 years hiatus from working that I started thinking about ingredients and, what I was putting into my kids' bodies, but kind of what hadn't I been doing with myself? And one day I looked down at my diet soda, my Diet Coke in particular, and I thought, there's a lot of ingredients in this product that I would never give to my kids. Why am I okay putting it in myself? I think my answer really was, kind of interesting. Here I'd been in marketing and sales my whole life, but I had been trusting that diet was better for me. And I had become totally addicted to Diet Coke. And so I thought, I'm going to do a little test and give up my diet soda, start drinking water and see what happens. And 2.5 weeks later, I lost 24 pounds in 2.5 weeks. My skin cleared up. I started looking at like, why is this? I mean, this is crazy. And studying, the effects of when you're putting anything sweet in your body, the power of your brain and producing insulin. I used to think that insulin was only something that you talked about if you had diabetes. Like it was just all these misconceptions that I was just fascinated by. And suddenly I thought, okay, well, I'm not going back to drinking diet soda, but I just have one problem still. And that is that water is so darn boring to me that I'll never be hydrated in my whole life. And so I started slicing up fruit and throwing it in water, and I had this aha moment. That's all I need. I don't need all the rest of the stuff that's in these drinks. And so that was kind of the early stages of Hint. And then I looked for this product in stores because I didn't want to start a beverage company. What do I know
Right.
about beverages? I mean, it was
Right.
like, I'm like, no, 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 that I buy the beverages. I don't actually start them. And when I went to Whole Foods, they had just opened in the Bay Area. And I thought, this is exactly the kind of place that would have a product like the one I'm making in my kitchen. And they didn't have it. And instead, what I found myself, I was in a situation where I was educating people in the store at Whole Foods about things like vitamin water was a brand new drink. Not brand new, but for me, it was fairly new. And it was, it was interesting because it had a lot of ingredients in it, but it also, they didn't even have a diet version of that product. And people, friends of mine would drink vitamin water just like I was drinking Diet Coke and not really realizing that it had more sugar in it than a can of Coke.
Mhm.
Right. And I
Mhm.
was like, so why did you think that it was healthier for you? And they said, because it says vitamin. And I thought, there's all these words that focus on the consumer and trick the consumer. And I got mad. I got really mad about how there's these, healthy perception versus healthy reality going on. And there's a, multi-billion dollar industry in the soda industry, but then there's the diet industry and, people allow this stuff to go on. And I thought, it's really wrong on a lot of levels. And I can either focus on going after what's wrong with that, or I can actually take my little drink from the kitchen and try and get it on the shelf at Whole Foods. How hard could it be?
I know, I've got one right here, and you did it, girl. And you know what's funny is I'm looking at this ingredients, purified water and natural flavors. Like, it's that simple, 0 calories.
Super, super simple. And that's it. Like I looked on both coasts when I was thinking about starting this product because I thought, again, I haven't been in the industry. I kept asking people who had been in the food and beverage industry, and they're like, you know nothing about this. You're gonna fail from the get-go. And I think coming from a different industry, coming from a love of beverages, right? Like I might have loved my diet soda more than my family. I mean, I drank so much of it every single
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know, there's probably a lot of people out there like me. Otherwise, it wouldn't they wouldn't be spending money on television or they wouldn't have,
Right,
lots of
right.
sales. And I thought, I wonder how many of these people just don't know that drinking this stuff, drinking this sweet, even at that time it was 10 calories, is actually doing kind of the reverse. Like they've given up on being able to, you know, lose weight or control their type 2 diabetes or, whatever it is, because they just don't think that they can. But what if somebody actually gave them a product that just tasted great and it gave them hope that they could? That's the story of Hint. That is the power of what we've heard over and over again from consumers. I'll never forget getting the first, one of the first bottles sold at Whole Foods. I know that I'm going to launch the product. We take about 9 months to figure out that I've got my business plan. I'm figuring out the product. Producing the first few cases was delayed. So I get the product like a day before we're going to go and have a planned C-section. And so the morning I wake up to my planned C-section date, May 27th, 2005, I said to my husband, let's go to Whole Foods and see if I can get the product on the shelf. And he said, gosh, not what I was thinking you were going to say. I thought we were going to, go on a walk or go to brunch or something. And I said, no, 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 it'll be great. Like, hopefully they'll take it. That's when I went in and he the first thing the guy said to me at Whole Foods, I hadn't been in for a couple of months and definitely popped the last 2 months, but he said, wow, you're really pregnant. And I said, I know. And he said, you're not going to deliver right now in the store. And I said, I hope not. I'm having a baby like this afternoon in a planned C-section. And he said, what's the difference between a planned C-section and a emergency? And of course, my husband's like, oh my God, she's gonna like talk to him and tell him where babies come from. And I did. I was like explaining all the ins and outs, and he thanked me. And then I said, by the way, can you get our product on the shelf this afternoon? And he said, I'll try, but I didn't know whether or not that was going to happen. And then I went to the hospital and delivered Justin. And the next day he called me and said, the product is gone. I had been focused on getting the product on the shelf, but I didn't really think about like selling 10 cases
Restocking.
overnight.
Right.
I was having a baby, right? Like, I mean, that was the last of, what I was thinking about. He sold through 10 cases. One of those cases went to a consumer who wrote me. We had done something a little bit different, and not many brands were doing this 17 years ago, but we put our email and our phone number on the bottle. And so I'm at home, I'm recovering from having the C-section. And this gentleman writes to me and said, I absolutely love this product. I just bought it at Whole Foods and I've been looking for a product like Hint. I have a disease called type 2 diabetes. Now, remember, 17 years ago, I mean, it was a very small percentage of the population. And I thought, you know, what is type 2 diabetes? So I emailed him back and said, I've never heard of type 2 diabetes. How is that different from type 1 diabetes? And he said, it's really interesting. They don't know a lot about it. It's a very small, it's like 2% of the population has type 2 diabetes. But what I found is that in my own personal life, this is what he was sharing with me. He said, when I have diet sweeteners, like I thought the diet sweeteners were better for me, but the way that my body reacts to diet sweeteners causes insulin resistance. And so I've got this type 2 diabetes, and I'm like, wow, this is fascinating, right? And so I think hearing this story about how he found drinking a product like Hint was helping him to live with this disease, right? And we've heard from consumers who have shared stories like that where they've actually gotten rid of their diabetes, right? And I think for me, I wanted to get healthy by losing the weight that I shouldn't have been carrying around, clear up my skin, all of these things. More than anything, what I saw early on, and really what kept me going during these really challenging days, and there certainly were in the journey, was that the consumer reaction to what I was giving them and how it helped them to get healthy. So even early on, when people were saying to me, oh, what's it like to be a beverage executive? I always focused on the consumer and sort of the bigger mission and purpose behind what a $2 or less bottle of water could do for somebody. And a lot of this I talk about in my book. It's like, it wasn't just for me about building a company. It was this education around, really doing something that many thought was impossible, including consumers.
Well, and your husband was sort of, "Gosh, I think you're a little bit crazy, and what are you doing?" And it's such an incredible story, and I think what I love about it is you were focused on solving a problem and you were focused on serving others. And I think as all business owners and leaders and aspiring leaders, if we keep that at the front of the way that we wake up every day, it's gonna be hard to go wrong, right? Focus on solving a problem and serving your customers. It's powerful. Tell me this, and you talk about this a little bit in the book, overcoming self-doubt. How did you, block out the doubters?
I think it's a story of visionaries, right? People who have an idea that is just so far afield from what anybody else can imagine. And I think I've always been that. It's funny, I've always had a pulse on what's gonna happen next. I'll never forget, and I'll go back to this, I'll never forget one of our first trade shows that we were at. We happened to be next to, Chobani, and Hamdi was sitting right next to us, and I'm like, literally scooping the yogurt out in this like terrible booth that he had. I mean, it was like nothing. And it was just a great product with like real fruit, and it was amazing. And I went to him and I'm like, Hamdi, okay, I want to do a hint version of Chobani. And he said, I'll do it for you. And I was like, really? This is over 3 days. We had this full conversation going. Hamdi was in my court.
Right.
Right. He was
Right. And
like,
he's the founder and CEO.
oh yeah. And he was in my court. Everything was happening. And and Chobani just took off. But I laughed. I still laugh at him to this. I was in his offices like a year ago and I was cracking up. I'm like, seriously, unsweetened yogurt.
Yeah.
Like that's where I was going with this. And so anyway, it was funny. So he never did it. We never partnered on it.
That fuels you, doesn't it? I mean, no, or you can't do this, or Kara, what are you thinking? It fuels you.
It fuels me. One of the things that I've realized, I think, over the years with age is that, and meeting many successful people in a lot of different industries, everybody thinks that they can't at some point along the way. And I think that it is totally normal to have doubters and especially doubters in your own industry. I found actually, I mean, one of the things that I share with entrepreneurs where I got the biggest kind of energy, but also it was a place that was very freeing for me to go and think and sort of not live around doubters, but instead just go learn is even as I was, speaking at so many conferences over the years, kind of sharing our story, I would go into totally different industry conferences, because I would find that, for example, if I wanted to know about direct to consumer, I remember sitting there watching Neil from Warby Parker on stage talking about, I mean, what in the world is a beverage entrepreneur doing watching, you know, kid out of Wharton who's
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
eyeglass guy. But it was an industry that's crowded, that like I got it. We were speaking the exact same language. I needed to understand how he thought about the nuts and bolts, right? I didn't need the vision. I sort of got that part, but I needed to understand how he was thinking about the stuff that would allow me to take that and go in. And I mean, he's just one example, but again, when you place yourself into situations like that where you're just going to go learn, you're not going to have people saying, who needs direct to consumer in the beverage industry? I didn't need to hear that. Like I got it. Part of me was already thinking that too. But when you surround yourself, and I think that that's the problem that so many entrepreneurs do, they think like, okay, I'm in the beverage industry. I'm going to sit in the beverage industry. I mean, you mentioned Sarah
Mm-hmm.
Blakely. I'm sure Sarah Blakely, she wasn't sitting there trying to like hang out with the people from Hanes, right?
Right.
Or
No.
like Saw, right? I mean, most people would say, oh, you've got to like hang out in the garment industry or in the, you know, that's not where you're going to learn, where you're free to sort of think about how can I push the envelope forward. And so I think for me, it was always like finding places where I could learn was where I was able to kind of seek refuge from the doubts that were going on in my own head.
And I remember, I mean, Kobe Bryant, would reach out to leaders, executives, right? He wasn't reaching out to people in the game per se. I'm sure he did that some, but he was reaching out to leaders and executives that he could learn from as he prepared, I believe it was to retire. I mean, some of my athletes and coaches, would lean into a lot of people outside of their space or their sport so that they could learn from them and get better. I mean, I believe in that too, Kara. I mean, I think that, and clearly it has worked for you, no doubt about it, right? One of the things you talk about too, and is complacency, and you talk about it, from time to time, and I saw this all the time in sports, right? Because I find that sometimes success can breed complacency, right? Unintentionally, right? We have some success and then we sort of settle in. But in sports, you can't ever really get complacent because somebody's wanting to take your job every single day, showing up at the field and wants to. How do you think people can overcome complacency in their lives?
I think sometimes it's you force yourself, right? When I find myself even in, a challenging situation, right? Or I feel like I'm bored or, there's something just really off. I think being in touch with yourself and understanding that you have to put yourself out into, first of all, you have to keep moving in some direction and go try new things. But I think oftentimes you have to put yourself into a zone where you're not that comfortable. You speak about being an athlete. I was an athlete growing up and I did a lot of gymnastics. I would, that was the one rule in our house. Like my parents always, all five kids, we were always in some kind of sport. And, I was humbled being in sports because you can't be good at every single sport. Right. So I wasn't constantly trying to be the best at everything. I tried my hardest and I always tried to be a little bit better than I was yesterday. Right. And I mean, that was my mindset every single day. And then there were some things like catch a ball and softball where I was so terrible at that, but I was a great runner. And so if you could get me, and I wasn't too bad at hitting, but I was terrible at, catching the ball. But if you can be yourself and stop taking yourself so seriously. People still wanted me on their team, right? Because I was funny, whatever. I just didn't take myself that
They just
serious.
threw you in right field and
Whatever.
and
Like
let you
it's just,
run.
yeah. And it was just, I would laugh every single day. I would just be having a good time. And
But see, you weren't afraid to get uncomfortable, and I think that that's a really integral point that you're making. I mean, discomfort equals growth, I believe. I mean, I think that when we get uncomfortable, we have an opportunity to get a little bit better, right? And then a little bit better, and it's like a muscle that we can get stronger so that we can lean into change more.
well, and I find too that if I'm ever in a situation where I really fear something and I don't know whether or not I should move forward, I think that if I'm saying it enough times in my head and really thinking about it, I come to a place and I have to decide whether or not I do this or I don't. But stop, talking about it and thinking about it.
Hi there, it's Molly, and I've got some exciting news to share with you. In just a few weeks, I'll be launching my first ever on-demand course that's crafted to help you up your game and unlock the drive to fuel next level success. Go to mollyfletcher.com/waitlist to join the waitlist, and you'll be the first to know when my new course launches and get an exclusive discount. Again, that's mollyfletcher.com/waitlist. Are you ready to up your game? Sign up today. Has your confidence grown from all these little moments of discomfort at some level, right? Of stepping into these fears a bit? Has that strengthened your confidence, or where does your confidence come from?
I think the more experiences that you put yourself into, I think you're absolutely right. I think as you grow older, I think taking risk is definitely something where, you realize that you make it through somehow. I mean, it's funny. I have four kids, and they're all the youngest one, Justin, who's the star of Whole Foods. When we launched Tint, he's a junior in high school now. But it's interesting. I mean, we'll sit there, we'll have a bad day, something will happen that we'll have challenges along the way. My four kids are the most zen kids because they see stuff that happen and they're like, hey, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I don't know if we'll be fine. I think actually they've seen situations that have been rocky. We don't like not talk about it, right? Because I think for us, like, we know we have EQ enough to sort of know when to, tone it down or whatever, but I think that the more they can sort of understand that successful people, moms, everyone has real people have challenges along the way, and they're not always pretty, but I think you still have to get up. The sun comes up every day, goes down every day, and you deal. And I think that, I'm excited to sort of see what they end up doing, knowing that, they've seen risks and all those things, kind of happen. I think that that's an important piece.
Yeah, it reminds me, I remember, my mom had breast cancer, and I was on the phone with my business coach, and they were pulling in the driveway, and I sort of said, "Look, I actually I really gotta hop because 'cause I've gotta be here and locked in when she walks in." And he said, "But, just a minute, before you go, I need you to know something." He said, "Your girls are watching the way you handle this." And my husband and I have 3 daughters, teenagers too, and it was so wonderful. It was such wonderful advice because it just you forget when you're in your world, but our kids are watching all of it, like all of it. The personal, the professional, and they're learning from it. And obviously those are the people that we want to learn from us in so many ways the most is our children. But in the book Undaunted, that's the title of your book, obviously. What does that word mean to you?
I think it has a lot to do with resilience. It has a lot to do with knowing that, you're going to look, the most interesting people have challenges along the way, but they get back up and they figure out how to live in spite of these challenges and continue moving forward. And I think to be undaunted, it's a powerful word. It's a word that I think that people who live undaunted are fearless. They never have any challenges. Everything was you know, just ends up happening, and everything is they're Wonder Woman, right? And I think most people who, live undaunted have plenty of challenges, have seen, many bumps in the road, but they don't allow those challenges or bumps to define who they are. Instead, they live a life knowing that, as my mom used to say to me, that challenges wouldn't come in your lane if, the world didn't think that you couldn't handle them, right? I think about that a lot, that it's a test. And so often I find too that the challenges that we encounter, instead of actually allowing it to define you, it may actually be the thing that you need to get you to the next level. Removed from Hint was being removed from Starbucks. And when I was trying to figure out what to do with our inventory, I got an email from a buyer at Amazon, and Amazon wanted to put our product in. And luckily, we had product because it wasn't going to be going into Starbucks. And I said to the buyer, "How did you hear about Hint? I'm so curious," because we were still pretty small and we weren't in Seattle stores and outside of Starbucks. But he said, every morning I go into Starbucks and I buy my latte and I buy a bottle of Hint. And I thought, for weeks I'd been beating myself up thinking, "Ugh, like why were we in Starbucks? What was the purpose?" It's like, such a bump in the road and we're such a failure." I mean, I had been thinking about it and I thought, wow, like maybe that's the thing that I needed to learn from the why behind the Starbucks. Even though there's challenges and it looks murky and dirty, maybe there is actually a reason. And the fact that the buyer was saw it for the first time at Starbucks, and that's the thing. Like sometimes when you're in this like really, yucky situation, sometimes it's really hard to actually see if there was what were the learnings, what was the good until later, right? As Steve Jobs used to say, the dots eventually connect. And I think about that all the time.
How do you tactically what are some of the things that you do to continue to learn, to continue to grow, to continue to evolve? I mean, you are clearly an incredibly curious person. All day long, all around you, you're curious. Tell me what we can learn from you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm constantly reading. I have stacks and stacks of books. I when I traveled, it was easier for me to read books, but I started, listening to a lot of. I listened to a lot of books and podcasts, and so I'm constantly like, I love information, and I probably don't absorb it all, but I pick up on little pieces. I also. Social media for me, I think it's look, it definitely has a downside to it, and it can be a time suck. But I think the number of people that I've met through social media, and it's not on Bumble or any of these other. I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like on Twitter, where like I'll purposely find people who think differently from me because I want
Cool.
to learn how the world thinks about things, because I think if I understand how the world thinks, it's not that I'm like tricking people into believing that I think differently. I just am curious. And I think that you can learn a lot more from people if you're not trying to change them too. I'm just working to understand who they are, right? And I think that I have a love of the consumer, right? And I want to think how people got there. I also think that so often people will show up and kind of tell you that they believe things or they're a certain way because they've had a journey that they can't explain.
What would you say are your biggest leadership lessons that you've learned during your journey?
Well, I think, that one in particular is just being you, right? I think that no matter what level you are, I've always felt like eh, there's this concept of kind of climbing the corporate ladder that I think is just who cares, right? It's been a really, I think like the biggest challenge as a leader that I've had is trying to understand when people, you know, want to get from this title to this title. Like, I'm just like, oh, it's so not
Mhm.
like, just give you the money, right? I mean, it's just not really that important. It's hard for me to sort of look at that. I think more than anything, being an authentic leader, being yourself, definitely sort of being able to put yourself on the other side of the table at times too. I think, during COVID is probably one example. People would say, oh, well, you're a mom, you're a parent, all these people that are on the hint team need to homeschool their kids. And, it's like really challenging. I'm sure you've been through something like this. And I mean, the first thing I did when I started seeing that people were having to do this and schools were closing, I've never homeschooled my kids. I can't imagine. Like, my kids are older. My high school kid was, hopefully by the time he was in high school, able to sort of get on Zoom and sort of deal, but I wasn't sitting there trying to, take a 4-year-old and say, "Here's your screen, don't
Right.
move." Right? Like,
Right.
I mean,
Brutal.
it's hard, right?
Oh, for
So
sure.
right? And so instead, when you don't have actually the experience and you can't really put yourself into the shoes of somebody that you're trying to lead, don't pretend, right? Be empathetic, right? And own it, right? That's the other thing is like, I think that you can't lead if you don't own it. You can pretend, you can have a title and you can pretend to lead, but if you are not able to own something, especially when you've made a mistake, then you're not a leader, you're a farce.
That's what leadership is owning it.
It's owning it,
In the
right?
good, yeah,
And everyone makes mistakes.
100%.
Everybody missteps things. But if you can't rectify situations or say that that was really, you know, a mistake and that's my bad, and instead you just pretend to you sweep it under the rug or you just move on from it because there weren't that many people affected by the situation, whatever the case is, then you're not leading. You were just put in that position by accident.
Well, and I see the best ones, right, as a coach after a game that they've lost. and the media's drilling the players. And the coach steps in and says, "Hey, guys, that was me. That wasn't these guys, right? Like, I made that call. I jammed that up. I messed that up." And those are the players that go hard for that coach, right?
Yeah. No, totally.
All right, we're going to end with rapid fire. I'm going to hit you with some quick ones and you just fire back. You ready?
Yeah.
Boil your success down to 3 words.
It's 4 words. Willing to show up.
Willing to show up. Love it. A book you recommend most often for leaders.
I'm staring at it right now because I've read it like 8 times over and over again. Such a good book. Have you read this? $1 Trillion Coach.
Love it. No.
Do you know who Bill Campbell is? He's sort of a legend in Silicon Valley. He passed away a few years ago, but it's the leadership playbook of Silicon Valley. It was written by Eric Schmidt, Jonathan Rosenberg, and Alan Eagle. But I mean, just to give you an idea, Tim Cook, Sheryl Sandberg, John Doerr, all on the back. But he was truly a legend. And he was the person that so many VCs and overall mentors recommended to founders to, bring Bill Campbell in to sort of coach. He was a coach.
What's one thing you wish you knew earlier in your career?
I think the most important thing, I was just telling an entrepreneur this earlier, is that especially when you're ahead of things, right? You're not everyone can see what you see as the future. I think that 2 things. First of all, competition is never it's not nearly as bad of a thing as you want to make it out to be. And oftentimes you need competition in order for people to recognize that it's a thing, right? And
Right.
otherwise it's like this weird thing. But now it's really a thing that you have to have.
That's funny the way, yeah.
And the only thing you can do is focus on making your product better. And I think that just sort of flows into the next thing, is that I think that you're always going to have competition. And the most important thing is staying alive.
So the show's called Game Changers. So last question, what or who is a game changer that inspires you and why?
I would say my partner in life, Theo, he grew up in a very different life than I grew up in. Much more restricted, methodical. This is where you're going to go to school. This is what you're going to do. All of that. When he met me, he was like, "You live with 1 foot off of a cliff and you seem to be doing fine like most of the time." But I think for me, meeting somebody who I think is willing to take risks just by hanging out with me, going on 27 years of marriage now, but also being able to change industries, go and do things. A lot of the stuff that I talked about earlier around producing a product that didn't have preservatives in it, figuring out so many things over the last 2 years logistically around supply chain that so many companies have had problems with. He's a game changer. I mean, he doesn't have fears. And yet I think he would be a person who would say that he always was very prescriptive. He was not somebody who would figure out a problem, yet he loves problems. And he doesn't complain about the problems. He just faces them and just goes and takes them on. And so I think being able to have somebody like that around me all the time, who's willing to put up with me and, be a little crazy and go along for the ride, but also is willing to be such a massive support system in business and in life, I think is not trying to change people either too. I think that's the thing. Instead, just kind of going with the flow is that's a game changer.
Kara, this has been awesome. So fun.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me.
I loved it. And I know so many people will. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was an awesome conversation with Kara, and a couple things that really sort of bubbled up for me that I think are important to highlight. Number one, create your own opportunities. When Kara didn't see the product she wanted on the shelves, she made it herself. If the opportunities you want aren't coming to you, you have to create them yourself. I love that at the core that was anchored in seeing a gap in the market and closing it. Number two, build the airplane while you're flying it. From her career in tech, Kara learned that you have to get the basics right for launch, but you can fix everything else as you go along. Sometimes the biggest thing standing in your way is just getting started. And number three, this is a good one because fear blocks us of so much. Face your fears. Face your fears. Everyone thinks that they can't at some point along the way, right? That they can't. But as Kara says, to live a life undaunted, you have to understand what your fears are. Know when to face them and when to work through them, when to walk and step right into them and keep going. Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. This episode was edited and sound designed by the team at Sound On Studios. You can find out more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. Check it out. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.